Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode of Day by Day. I'm Noah Davis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about a few things. First, we're going to be talking about the discovery of King Tut's tomb. Next, we'll be talking about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And finally, we'll be talking about the election of Abraham Lincoln. But first, we're going to be talking about the discovery of King Tut's tomb. This is one of my personal favorite historical stories, not just the discovery itself, but basically everything having to do with King Tut and his father Akhenaten, who we are going to get to in due course. So the discovery of King Tut's tomb happens November 4th of 1922. This is led by British archaeologist Howard Carter and his benefactor Lord Carnarvon. This happens in the Valley of the Kings, or the Valley of the Tombs, in kind of southern, what is now Egypt. And this is where, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of different tombs were being exhumed, where they were being discovered. This was especially prominent with an American businessman named Theodore Davis. However, after years and years in excavations, in 1914, Davis noted, quote, "I fear the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted after 6 continuous years of basically no discoveries." Howard Carter, he is a British Egyptologist. He was born in 1873. He lives until 1939. Carter starts exploring the Valley of the Kings in 1915. Now, this is right after Davis said that quote that he thinks that the Valley of the Tombs is exhausted, but Carter disagreed. He thought that he was going to be able to find something. Now, his first 6 years are tough. He exhausts his funding and he discovers very, very little. Now, the last 2 months of 1922, they were going to be his last season. November 1st of 1922, Carter began clearing remains of huts that were used by ancient workmen near the entrance to the tomb of Ramses VI. November 4th, the day that we are celebrating, he discovers the first of 16 steps cut into the valley floor. November 5th, he clears 12 of the 16 steps. He saw the top of a blocked doorway. The doorway was sealed in plaster, and it was stamped with the insignia of the royal necropolis, so those who were in charge in ancient Egypt of burying royalty. Carter sends a telegraph to Lord Carnarvon to arrive. He has to wait until Lord Carnarvon gets there, but November 24th, he finally arrives, and this is the day that the rest of the rubble on the stairs and the doorway is cleared. This reveals signs of Tutankhamun stamped around the doorway. He realized, though, that he needs some assistance. He needs some help with this. He doesn't have that big of a team. Luckily for him, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's archaeology team was nearby, so he asked them for help. The most important person in this team was Harry Burton. Burton was the photographer of the team. Carter was no professional photographer, but Burton definitely was. He took a ton of photos of King Tut's tomb, and that's how we have so much preserved today of these original photos. That's also going to be Burton's biggest legacy. Now, the tomb itself. The tomb itself was one of the smallest in the Valley of the Kings. After we get down those 16 steps, we go to our first doorway. This leads to a passageway that's 25 feet long and only about 5.5 feet wide, and it was filled with debris. However, the debris was cleared. After being cleared, an entrance to the first room, or the antechamber, was found. It was blocked, and there was a small head of the figure of the king. Now, they were able to get into the antechamber, which is 26 feet wide and 11.5 feet long. So, decent size, but it is still relatively small compared to a lot of the other tombs. Now, the antechamber is filled with just different tomb furniture. We get chariots, chairs, boxes, vases, and a half bust of King Tut. And these weren't just simple, basic objects. These were extremely ornate. One of my personal favorites was these horse blinders that were inscribed with the eyes of Horus on them. Guarding the burial chamber, the main room where King Tut is actually buried, were 2 life-size statues of the king and a beautiful chest. This came to be known as the Painted Box. The sides were decorated with battle scenes of Tut over his enemies. So on one side, it was him fighting the Syrians to his north, and the other was fighting the Nubians to his south. This was the first object that was actually removed from the tomb. There was another entrance, also sealed, on the north wall. This led to the burial chamber. The burial chamber itself was 13.5 feet wide and about 21 feet long. When that seal was removed, Carter thought that he saw a solid wall of gold. This was not a solid wall of gold, but it was one of 4 shrines, and these were made of gilded wood, so wood that was covered in gold, so it definitely looked like a solid wall of gold. These shrines were so large that there was less than 3 feet of room around the sides of the shrine, so it was pretty cramped in there when Carter and his team first got inside. Inside, kind of on the outskirts of those shrines, they found significant items like ores, fetishes of Anubis, and an alabaster lamp. These are all especially significant when it comes to the afterlife. Ores were used for the journey to the afterlife. Anubis is honored as the embalming god, and his statuettes are also there for protection. That alabaster lamp is there to light the way to the afterlife for Tut. Once the first shrine was removed, it revealed the second shrine, and the second shrine was sealed with a cord and a clay seal with the sign of the necropolis. This indicates that the inside of that second shrine were probably not touched, and that was a big relief. It took 8 months for Carter and his team to remove all the shrines, but they finally got inside. Within the shrines was the sarcophagus, and it had 3 nested coffins with the mummy of Tutankhamun. So the sarcophagus, basically a giant box made of red quartzite, and the coffins. So the first 2 were gilded, so they were covered in gold, and they were really heavy. The third coffin revealed why it was so heavy. That third and innermost coffin was solid gold. Inside of that third coffin, they finally got to the mummy. It was adorned with a ton of jewelry, including 13 extremely ornate bracelets that went all the way from the wrist to the elbow of Tut's mummy. There was one more room off of the burial chamber. This comes to be known as the treasury. This was about 15.5 feet wide to 12.5 feet long. This housed different shrines containing the king's organs. These were guarded by Anubis and chests with statuettes of different goddesses. Also found in the treasury were 18 decently large model boats for Tut to use on his journeys into the afterlife. The last room was actually off of the antechamber. There was this small opening in the wall that was originally plastered shut, and it led to the annex, room 14 feet wide by 8.5 feet long. This was also filled with furniture and miscellaneous items. It took 6 weeks to unload. This eventually yielded, the whole tomb eventually yields 5,398 separate finds. These go from tiny beads to those big shrines that we talked about earlier. So that's the tomb itself. But who was King Tut, and why is the tomb so important? Well, thanks to the tomb, we now know a lot more about King Tut. He ruled from approximately 1336 BC to 1327. It's part of the 18th dynasty. The tomb, like I mentioned, was located in the Valley of the Kings. This is behind the cliffs west of modern-day Luxor, what was ancient Thebes. Between 1898 and 1914, 61 tombs were identified from the 18th through the 20th dynasties, all the way from 1550 to 1070 BC. Before the discovery of Tut's tomb, very little was known about him. He was originally thought to have had a very short reign, and because of this, it was thought that he had come to power in his later years, which is why the reign was so short. The tomb revealed that instead of just 3 or 4 years, like was thought before, he actually ruled for 9 to 10 years, and he died at the very young age of 19. Some furniture and clothing found in the tomb were suitable for a 10 or 11-year-old. That's about how old Tut was when he became pharaoh. Tut's father was Akhenaten, a pharaoh before him. And the mother is unknown exactly what her name was. She's just been come to known as the Younger Lady. His wife was Ankhesenamun, who was also his half sister. Of his family members, Akhenaten is the most important. He is still considered to be one of the most fascinating pharaohs. Akhenaten ruled for approximately 17 years. The biggest things that he did, he instituted some artistic changes. He moved the capital to a new city that he called Akhetaten, modern Amarna, when the original capital was Thebes. The most important thing he did, though, is that he instituted some religious changes. Akhenaten was originally named Amenhotep IV, after his father, Amenhotep III. Amen, that first part of his name, is also the name of one of the Egyptian chief gods. Amen, the god, was a air god, and he was also considered a god of creation. And he was the chief god when Akhenaten came into power, but definitely not the chief god. Later, Akhenaten changes his name to Akhenaten from that Amenhotep IV. He removes that Amen name in the beginning, and it promotes Aten, who was a different god. Aten was the sun god. He was seen as Ra combined with Horus, and he was represented as the sun disk. So, kind of an image of the sun with hands reaching out from it. After Akhenaten instituted these religious changes, new temples were built, and priests were taught to glorify Aten over the other gods. Even his new capital, Akhetaten, has the name of Aten in it. It literally means the horizon of Aten. New religious practices in Akhenaten's 5th through his 10th years put Aten as the sole force of order. Now, other gods weren't just sidelined, but they were completely ignored, and some were even persecuted. Now, even though this was a big change, right? This is kind of considered to be the first sign of monotheism that we see, especially outside of the Bible. Egypt was a fundamentally polytheistic society, and so instituting this kind of proto monotheism was extremely controversial, and later it's going to be condemned a lot. Even though this was a very big shakeup, most of Akhenaten's reign had peace. The end of his reign, kind of the last 3, 4, 5 years, has a lot of dry spells and sources, so we don't know too much about it. But we do know that Tutankhamun succeeds him. His original name was Tutkhaten, kind of going and glorifying Aten, but he returns to Amun. So Tutankhamun, that Amen at the end of his name, is for that god, because he is starting to institute the return to Amen as the main god, so he changes his name. Tut is also going to move the capital back to Memphis, northern Egypt, from Akhetaten, how it was. Now, Tut is going to go on to rule. His rule was relatively peaceful, but it was also very short. We think that Tutankhamun had some diseases. We think that he had to walk with a cane from a very young age. And after his death, 2 successors come after him. The second of those 2, Horemheb, starts removing the names of everyone after the death of Amenhotep III, who was Akhenaten's father, to him. This is why we know so little about Tut and why his tomb is so important. Because of that controversial change to having Aten as the chief deity and the only deity, Horemheb really wanted to get rid of that big chunk of dynasty. So honestly, originally, we weren't even sure that King Tut was real. It's a very big part of why his tomb is so important. This was a very unknown period of time in Egyptian history. The most significant part of King Tut's tomb is that back in antiquity, grave robbing was a huge deal. Back when pharaohs were first buried, grave robbers would go and they would kind of loot the tombs of all their riches, especially around the 13th and 12th centuries BC. Tut's tomb was probably broken into once, maybe twice, but that was most likely shortly after his death. We know that The seals that were broken were replastered over and resealed by the necropolis, like we talked about. After it was finally resealed, it was largely left untouched until it was eventually discovered by Carter. So, about 3,000 years of being untouched. This is why it was so important. Even though it was a relatively small tomb compared to a lot of the other ones, there's so much stuff in there that Egyptologists and archaeologists didn't have access to before because most tombs were already robbed, that this was that big of a deal. After Carter discovers it, he publishes 3 volumes on it. He invites royalty. The Belgian queen at the time comes to visit because she was a big Egyptophile, and it gains international fame. The gold mask of King Tut's innermost coffin. That is what we kind of all know and love when we think of ancient Egypt, right? It is a very big sign of ancient Egypt. Now, unfortunately, Carter dies in March of 1939. A month later, the BBC aired a live radio recording of the playing of some of the trumpets that were found inside Tut's tomb. A few months after the airing of the sound of these trumpets, World War II started. This sparked rumors that those trumpets might have brought war. And to end this segment, I will play what those trumpets sound like.
And now the 2 trumpets will be blown by bandsman James Tapper, who is here by permission of the Colonel and officers of the 11th Prince Albert's Own Hussars. I must explain that neither trumpet is easy to sound, and this is particularly true of the copper instrument.
The trumpets of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun, Lord of the Crowns, King of the South and North, Son of Re.
All right, so moving on to our second topic for today, this is going to be on the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. There are a lot of dates for this that we could kind of mark, but for this purpose, for our calendar, it's going to be November 6th through the 7th of 1917. This is the day that the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seize power in the October Revolution, and they overthrow the provisional government. Before this, at kind of the start of all this, going into the early 1900s, we have the Romanov dynasty in charge, and this is centuries of Russian imperialism. This, at the time that this all starts, Tsar Nicholas II is in charge, and there's a lot of discontent with the government. We have economic hardship, food shortages, and a lot of government corruption. In the early 1900s, Russia was extremely underdeveloped compared to the rest of the modern world. Other Europeans thought of them as backwards, and there was a huge peasantry and a growing minority of these poor industrial workers. But largely, this is an agricultural state still. The Russian Empire still practiced serfdom until 1861, which is extremely late. Serfdom was the process of these poor peasants working the land of a lord that has land in exchange for, quote, protections. This is similar to kind of indentured servitude. Although they didn't necessarily have debt, it was one of the only ways to get protection while still being able to work. For reference, England got rid of serfdom in 1574. So we're nearly 300 years after the end of serfdom in England. We still have that practice in Russia. Because of how late the serfs were emancipated in Russia, they would definitely go on to influence this revolution. The Industrial Revolution took a lot longer to reach Russia. Russia didn't see this happen until the turn of the 20th century. This brought a ton of change. This brought a lot of harsh living and working conditions in the big cities, right? We have industry start to grow in these big cities. We have a population boom because of this, but this is going to lead to a lot of overcrowding. At the same time that this is happening, Russia is going through some quite failed wars, like the Crimean War and the Russo-Japanese War. Educated Russians are pushing for a better society, and they are realizing the Tsar's rule is supporting almost exclusively the aristocracy, and this was hampering the advancement of the society. This eventually leads to widespread protests. The most famous of this is going to be in January of 1905. This comes to be known as the Bloody Sunday Massacre. Protesters marched on Nicholas II's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. This was led by Orthodox priest Father Georgy Gapon. Leading up to this, Nicholas II was trying to ease tensions by allowing types of unions to be created and trying different ways to hear the people's voices. But these were kind of a sham, and the people still didn't feel represented. Father Gapon let Russian forces know that he planned to march on the Winter Palace. The march was largely over workers' rights in the increasingly industrial Russia, and the Tsar was not at the Winter Palace. They were informed about the protests, so he decided to go elsewhere. Now, women and children were a part of this march, and it was entirely peaceful. Even though the forces knew that it was happening, they couldn't stop it before it did. They started marching on the palace, totally peacefully, just with signs and some religious imagery. But what happened, whether the forces got nervous, whether somebody ordered them to shoot on the crowds, we don't know. But we do know that the Russian forces opened fire. And people who came to see what all this noise was about, they were also fired up. In this firing, over 1,000 were killed and 2,000 were wounded. This shattered whatever image was left of Nicholas II. His PR was not great anymore. A quote from one marcher that I like to mention was, quote, "On this day, I was born a second time, but now not as an all-forgiving and all-forgetting child, but as an embittered man, prepared to struggle and to triumph." After this, the government was slipping, and they were trying to make amends in any way possible, allowing more meetings of these unions instead of breaking them up. This proves to be the government's undoing, because it allows meetings of organizations that end up leading to the 1917 revolution that we'll be coming to shortly. Now, after the Bloody Sunday Massacre, we see a revolution take place in 1905. This is a smaller revolution, but it is the first that we see. This sees the implementations of Soviets, or these councils of workers' deputies. These are used to lead labor strikes and negotiate with authorities. Now, while the people were uprising, they didn't have a ton of support from the military. There was the uprising of sailors on the battleship Potemkin. This was an uprising by these sailors. They took control of the Russian battleship, trying to support the revolution, but that was about it. The revolution was kind of ended by this 1905 October Manifesto issued by Nicholas II. He brings out these promises of social, political, and economic reform. Now, at first, this is widely celebrated. A lot of people think, we have done our job, the revolution worked, now we have solutions. But this caused a lot of the Soviets that we talked about to lose their power and their backing among the people. But the manifesto was not implemented very well. There were a lot of empty promises. 1905 revolution largely fails to get anything major done because of separations among the people, and like I said, lack of support from the military. Jeffrey Hosking's 1997 book titled Russia, People and Empire, he has a quote that I think sums this up really well. He says, quote, "This underlines the extent to which the 1905 revolution took place in a society whose strata were still divided from one another, deprived of a civic focus, and incapable of common action." Basically, the revolution was too new, and it gained power too quickly to form real and consistent goals across the entirety of Russia. But still, this 1905 revolution is a very big precursor to the later revolution. One thing that did come out of the first revolution was the State Duma. The Duma was meant to be a form of representative government, but it was often foiled by the power of the Tsar. From 1905 to 1917, the new Duma is trying to steer policy in favor of the people, but to little avail, and much of Russia goes back to the way things were. Leaders of the revolution, like Vladimir Lenin, who we're going to be talking about in a minute here, they were despondent over their failure to capitalize on the 1905 revolution. It was just too disorganized and too disunified to succeed. 1914, World War I begins, and Russia is forced into the fight with the Entente, or the Allies. Now, Russia was late to the Industrial Revolution, like we said, and because of this, they were no match to fight the highly industrialized Germans. This led to a series of defeats, and it causes these huge food shortages and an economic crisis across the country. Nicholas II becomes commander in chief of the army. He thinks that they need better leadership, so he's going to step up, he's going to go to the front, and he's going to lead the troops from there. His wife, Alexandra Fedorovna, stayed in St. Petersburg with Rasputin. This is Grigory Rasputin. He was a Serbian mystic, healer, and he was a religious man who made his way up through the ranks and eventually gained trust of the royal family. He is one of history's most controversial figures. He is said to be this sex freak. It was highly rumored that him and the Queen were in bed together, especially after Nicholas II left the Queen and him in charge when he went to the front. Rasputin was a healer. He helped Alexandra and the Prince Alexei with their hemophilia, which is a bleeding disorder. Now, Rasputin was thought to have influenced policy and the Queen, and he was hated by aristocrats because of this, and because of his coarse behavior. He didn't bathe very often, his language was very coarse, and he was a notorious womanizer. In December of 1916, Rasputin is assassinated by Russian aristocrats. His influence over the royal family damaged Nicholas II's image even more. A lot of people thought that Nicholas II and his whole family were under the influence of this Serbian mystic. Rasputin is, of course, made famous by the 1974 Boney M song Rasputin, which I'm sure y'all have heard. Now, later, we have the February Revolution. This takes place February of 1917. The protest, the revolution, is originally led by women. These women's protests come in St. Petersburg, now at the time was named Petrograd, over bread shortages. And this took place on International Women's Day. The next day, students and workers join the women. They have signs saying "Down with the Tsar." Soldiers, who were supposed to put down the protests, end up joining them instead. So it's starting to gain a lot of steam. The capital is in chaos. March 2nd of 1917, Nicholas II abdicates the throne. So he is going to leave the throne. He thinks that this is the only way that there is going to be order restored. 300 years of Romanov rule ended because of the February Revolution. A provisional government is established. This was created by the State Duma, who shared power with the Petrograd Soviet. This new provisional government wanted to see a democratic Russia established. But this comes to be a fleeting hope. The Petrograd Soviet was dominated by more radical leftists, so them and the State Duma were at odds with each other. Still, both agreed to continue the war. Not the most popular decision among the people. This unpopular decision allowed the Bolsheviks to rise to power. The Bolsheviks were a smaller party. They were led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was a revolutionary. He was originally born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who was exiled to Siberia in his 30s for his revolutionary views. He eventually migrated to Western Europe and became the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. The Bolsheviks pushed for the membership of the party to be restricted to professional revolutionaries, while the opposition, the Mensheviks, called for mass membership in the party, and there were some other differences among the parties. Lenin demanded redistribution of land from landowners to peasants. He wanted transfer of power from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat, and the Bolshevik slogan came to be bread, peace, and land. This had a huge appeal to the masses, especially as war and economic disparity continues. As World War I goes on, the provisional government is still in charge. The Russians face even more disaster in the war. This leads to some mass protests in Petrograd from troops, and the troops get Bolshevik support. However, the provisional government sends their own troops to put this down. This leads to more killing of the protesters. This also leads to crackdowns on Bolsheviks and the arrests of many of them, including one Leon Trotsky, who we'll come to in a sec. But Lenin has to flee to Finland. He's declared to be a German spy by the provisional government, which he wasn't, but they wanted to villainize him as much as possible. Soldiers march on Petrograd in a military coup. So these are soldiers led by a top ranking Russian general who is kind of trying to seize power and push the Bolsheviks out. The Bolsheviks end up guarding the city against it with their leader Leon Trotsky, who was recently freed from prison. This causes this coup to fail. Bolsheviks are hailed as heroes because they defend the city and they gain a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin ends up returning to Russia in 1917 and he plans to get power. He starts the October Revolution, which is the day we're marking. On our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, this starts November 7th of 1917. The Russians used to use the Justinian calendar, so for them it did take place in October. Bolshevik soldiers seized key points around the city, and they stormed the provincial government's headquarters at the Winter Palace. The next day, after the storming of the palace, Lenin announced the overthrow of the provisional government, even though the prime minister was able to get away. This officially begins the Russian Civil War. Red soldiers, or the Bolsheviks, versus white soldiers, or the counter-revolutionaries. And a lot of these were supported by foreign governments. These foreign governments were Western European countries and America. They supported the whites because they were afraid of the spread of communism under the Bolsheviks. Some whites wanted to reinstate Nicholas II as Tsar. Nicholas II and his family, they were under guard by the Bolsheviks. The white forces were closing in on the Bolsheviks, coming to free the royal family. Because of this, the Bolsheviks kill the entire family. The Russian Civil War goes on, and it is extremely transformative, but also extremely deadly. Just in the fighting alone, there's an estimated 2 million soldiers that are killed. While the war is going on, we see a typhus epidemic and a famine, which leads to the death of 9 million citizens. By the end of 1921, the Bolsheviks end up winning the Russian Civil War. Under Lenin, they are now setting up the Soviet Union under communism. And this is what forms the Soviet Union that we all know. So, really, that's what this is marking. The Russian Civil War, the Bolshevik Revolution, leads to the establishment of the Soviet Union. Still, though, the Soviet Union remains a single-party state. That hope that was had for a democratic Russia ends up failing pretty quickly, and the Soviet Union becomes quite oppressive of dissenting opinions. But they are going to emerge as a real superpower, especially after the collapse of Germany after World War II. The marking of the Bolshevik Revolution is an extremely transformative day. It doesn't just see the rise of a political power, but the complete reconfiguring of a country that really leads to the complete reconfiguring of Europe until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. All right, for our final topic today, we're going to be talking about the election of Abraham Lincoln, which took place November 6th of 1860. Now, there are a lot of elections that we can choose from here. For this purpose, we're going to be doing Abraham Lincoln. Maybe in years to come, we can look at some other presidents and their elections, but we're going to be doing Lincoln's today. Now, there's a lot that can be said about Abraham Lincoln, and I can't say it all in the remaining time for this episode. So, today we're going to be focusing on his early life, and we are going to be focusing on his legacy a little bit. So, first off, who is Abraham Lincoln? Honest Abe. And did he really live in a log cabin in Illinois? Kinda. Abraham Lincoln was born February 12th in 1809 in Kentucky. His early years were tough. He lived in a log cabin with his family, and they moved to Indiana when Lincoln was 7. Lincoln learned hard work pretty early on. He was doing a lot of farm work, and in one of his autobiographies, he said that he was always carrying around his axe because he was in the middle of the woods, so he was definitely used to doing that. Now, Lincoln did attend basic school, and he was literate at a very young age, which was relatively uncommon for the time, especially if you were living in a rural area like Lincoln was. His mother, Nancy, died when he was only 9 years old, most likely of tuberculosis. At this time, Lincoln lived in a log cabin without a floor, and it was very poorly insulated. Lincoln's father, Thomas, ends up remarrying after the death of Lincoln's mother. Abraham's new stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, was extremely kind to Abe. She really fueled his love for reading, even though his father wasn't as fond of it. A lot of times, Lincoln's dad was annoyed that he chose to read instead of doing farm chores. But his new stepmother, Sarah, was very supportive, and she kind of convinced Lincoln's dad to encourage his reading and not discourage it. With this new marriage, it also introduced three new step siblings into Lincoln's life. Now, his new stepmother also made his father install a floor on the cabin, and she made him insulate the cabin a little bit better. So, life was improving. Lincoln also had a sister whose name was Sarah. She was 2 years older than Abraham. After the death of their mother, especially, the two got extremely close. Sarah ends up marrying in 1826, but unfortunately, she died in childbirth just a couple of years later. This impacted Lincoln profoundly. He sobbed at the news of her death. A few years later, at the age of 21, Lincoln ends up moving to Illinois on his own. He is getting his own start in life. He starts as a store clerk before the 1832 Black Hawk War starts, a conflict with Native Americans. He was elected as captain of volunteers in the war, which really starts his public and political life. Lincoln ran for state legislature the same year. He was beat the first time, but then he won 3 times in a row. He studied law for this, and he moved to Springfield, Illinois to practice it. He was eventually elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he served one term from 1847 to 1849 as a member of the Whig Party. In 1842, he married Mary Todd Lincoln, and they have 4 children. So that's his very basic life, but now we'll get into his beliefs and a little bit about his political life. Now, Lincoln ran as a Whig. Whig was one of the 2 biggest parties at the time, the other being Democrats. Whigs supported a very strong central government. They supported tariffs. The Whig Party began as an opposition party to Andrew Jackson. But the Whig Party was split on slavery. This is later going to lead to their collapse, but it also leads to the rise of the Republican Party. When Lincoln gets his first real public office in the Illinois House of Representatives, Illinois at the time was a frontier state. So it was kind of on the frontier of the United States, and it was a very rural state. Lincoln wanted to put the state on the map. He wanted to increase it from being a frontier state to really being something. Lincoln was big on internal improvement. So railroads, canals like the Illinois and the Michigan canals. He thought that these would bring commerce and new people to the state, which he thought that it desperately needed. By 1840, there were only about 475,000 people in the entire state of Illinois. This is compared to 1.25 million in Virginia at the same time. In Lincoln's career in the House of Representatives of the state, he had some victories. He got the state capital moved to his new hometown of Springfield. He was the Whig leader on the House floor as well. He also had some losses, though. The financial panic of 1837 was especially tough for Illinois, and because of this, internal improvements that he pushed for couldn't be made. His political opinions, though, were very informed by the climate of the time. Lincoln was a staunch Whig and a big supporter of Henry Clay. Clay was a presidential candidate in the 1832 election who ran and lost against Andrew Jackson. Clay pushed for what he called the, quote, American system. This supported strong tariffs, internal development of roads, railroads, and canals, and establishing a national bank. Tariffs were a huge issue for the time. In 1816, right after the War of 1812, tariffs were passed in a wave of American nationalism, right? Coming out of the War of 1812, we have a lot of patriotism for the country, and this tariff is to protect American industry against these cheap British goods that are flooding the market. And this was widely supported between both parties. In 1824, another tariff was passed, but this time it faced some opposition from the South. In 1828, yet another tariff passed, and this comes to be known as the Tariff of Abominations. Tariffs were opposed in the South because they were largely meant to protect northern industry, not as much southern interests. The South is still largely agricultural. On top of that, most of the revenue gained from the tariffs were going towards development mostly in northern states. South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, who was Jackson's vice president and a prominent politician, was extremely opposed to the tariffs, especially this new extremely high one. The tariff passed right after Andrew Jackson was elected for his first term, and the South thought that he would veto it, as a Democrat usually is opposed to tariffs, but he didn't. He said that it was constitutional. Because this tariff faced such high opposition, in 1832, South Carolina passed a nullification ordinance. This was a threat to independently nullify the tariff in their state, and this is unconstitutional. Andrew Jackson, even though he was a Democrat, he was largely on the side of these southern states. He absolutely refused this. He knew that this was unconstitutional. He threatened to send troops to forcefully establish the tariff. Before this can happen, though, the compromise tariff of 1833 is signed. This was a middle ground for the two sides, but the point of all this is that this paved the way for big states' right issues that we are going to come to later, that Lincoln is going to have to face later in his career. A lot of the stuff that is established, a lot of the arguments that are established with the so-called nullification crisis are going to rise up again in the face of slavery in about 30 years. Now, Lincoln's career in the House of Representatives. A few days after Lincoln was nominated for the House of Representatives, the Mexican-American War started. During his campaign, he said nothing about the war. He wanted to maintain a relatively middle ground so that way he could garner more support from across all the sides. However, he ends up winning the campaign, and when he does, he speaks out against the war. He delivers a scathing speech on the House floor. He challenges the Democrats' claim that the Mexicans were the ones who started the war. He speaks against then President James K. Polk, who we talked about last week. After his term in the House of Representatives is up, he practices law and he eventually leaves the Whig Party for the Republican Party. The Republican Party is relatively new at this time. They're like the Whigs in their beliefs, but they were definitely anti-slavery. In 1858, Lincoln runs for a U.S. Senate seat against Stephen A. Douglas, a Northern Democrat. Stephen Douglas was also an Illinois state representative at the same time as Lincoln, so this was not their first time crossing paths. The debates that the two have against each other garner national attention. Douglas was a big leader of the Democratic Party, and he is pushing for this belief in popular sovereignty for slavery. So these new states that are being admitted to the Union, namely Kansas, instead of being definitely pro-slavery or definitely anti-slavery, he thinks that the new residents of the state should vote on it themselves. This wasn't super popular down in the South, but Lincoln is still fighting an uphill battle. Lincoln is going to increasingly take the moral high ground. He gives his famous House Divided speech, the speech saying that the Union will not be able to survive if it is as divided as it is. Now, Lincoln was definitely anti-slavery, but he didn't quite yet believe in total equality like some other Republicans. He thought that African Americans should have the same rights as white men from the Declaration of Independence, that is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but he didn't think that they should be able to vote or hold public office quite yet. Lincoln ends up losing the senatorial run, but it does put him as a frontrunner of the Republican Party. The 1860 presidential election is coming up. Lincoln is the least known of the Republican nominees, but his successful debates in his senatorial run against Douglas spurred this publicity campaign, and Lincoln ends up winning the Republican nomination. The election coming up was not normal. Instead of having two parties, maybe three like we see today, he had four. There were four across the nation, and this split the vote a lot. We had Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, the Constitutional Union Party, and the Republican Party. The Northern Democrat, their candidate was Stephen Douglas, who we talked about. They believed in that popular sovereignty belief on slavery. Southern Democrats were by John C. Breckinridge, and the Southern Democrats were pro-slavery only, no matter what. The government has no right to ban slavery. That was their belief. The Constitutional Union Party, they were pro-slavery, but they wanted the preservation of the Union above all, led by John Bell. And finally, the Republican Party, led by Lincoln, obviously. The Republicans held the belief that they didn't necessarily need to end slavery immediately, but they did want to stop the spread of it to new states that were being admitted to the Union. Now, because the Democrats were split between the Northern and Southern Democrats, Lincoln ends up going on to win the election, with 180 electoral votes compared to the runner-up, Southern Democrat Breckinridge, with 72. This caused a huge reaction in the South. 7 out of the 11 states that Breckinridge won secede the month that Lincoln is inaugurated. The Civil War ends up beginning a few months after that. Now, we'll talk about the Civil War lots. We've got a lot of big dates coming up in December and January. But for now, we'll just talk about Lincoln. He has his presidency, he runs for re-election in 1864, and he wins almost entirely with little opposition. He had a successful first term, but obviously very challenging. And looking back, it's impressive that the election happened during a war. That is not always the case. Now, only a few months into the second term, and very close to the end of the Civil War, Lincoln decides to relax one night. He goes to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. to watch a playing of Our American Cousin. At a high point of the play, when the audience erupts with laughter, actor and Confederate spy John Wilkes Booth steps into the president's box and shoots him in the head once. Booth slashes one of Lincoln's guests on the arm and jumps out of the presidential box. Unfortunately, Lincoln does not survive this gunshot. He survives for another about 9 hours or so before dying the next morning, April 15th of 1865. His death garnered widespread attention and condemnation, even from Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Lincoln left a huge legacy of being a champion of liberty, and he was a man of respect and admiration across the country. To this day, many historians rate him as one of the top 3 presidents, along with FDR and George Washington. And our final segment for today is going to be on a famous birthday. Marie Curie, born November 7th, 1867, in Warsaw, in what was the Russian Empire, now Poland. Along with her husband, Curie studied radioactivity in the early 1900s and discovered 2 previously unknown elements, polonium and radium. She even coined the term radioactivity. She helped develop radioactive materials for use in medicine, especially during and after World War I. She helped develop new cancer treatments, and this led to her being awarded half of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, and she was the sole recipient of the Nobel Prize of Chemistry in 1911. This made her the first female to win the Nobel Prize. She leaves that legacy, and also, for those of you who have played the Fallout games, in Fallout 4, there is a science robot named after her. But that is going to be it for episode 2 of Day by Day. Thank you guys for joining us. Tune back in next Monday. We are going to be talking about the Night of Broken Glass. We're going to be talking a little bit about Napoleon, Nat Turner being killed, and a couple other things. So join us then, and we're even going to have a special guest next week. Thank you all for tuning in, and remember, today is a good day to make history. See ya.